Thank you for tuning into Dust Jacket, the podcast for Memoria College, where you too can participate in the great discussion. Today, we have another discussion about a book we think is very much worth discussing. I'm your host, Martin Cothran. Today, we're talking about The Triumph of the Therapeutic, The Uses of Faith After Freud, a book that doesn't get a lot of press anymore, but addresses what happens when Christianity is taken out of our culture and pastors and priests are replaced by psychological therapists. We hope you enjoy the discussion. Today, we're going to talk about the book, The Triumph of the Therapeutic by Philip Rieff. Rieff was the author of Freud, The Mind of the Moralist, and the collected papers of Sigmund Freud in 10 volumes. And so he knew quite a bit about Freud. And so this book has the interesting subtitle, Uses of Faith After Freud. So we're gonna talk about this book a little bit. I will start by simply observing that I think this is one of the great intellectual books. I like books myself that explain why things are the way they are. And this is, I think, one of the central books. If I had to put together a list of 5 or 10 books that help to explain why things are the way they are, this one would certainly be on the list. And so I'm going to be talking about this with my guest, Dan Sheffler. And so, Dan, let me open this up by simply asking, what is this book about?
This book is about our modern predicament, the sort of dumpster fire that we find ourselves in of, Rieff calls it anti-culture, that we have somehow found ourselves in this cultural situation where we don't have culture building anymore. The cultural building takes the form of cultural destruction and undermining all the institutions of culture. And he's investigating why that is. How did we get to this point? How did everything fall apart? And he traces that destruction to Freud and the psychoanalytic movement. And one of his arguments is that the great revolution or the great threat to classical Western culture is actually not Marxism, communism, the East, the things that people were fearing through much of the 20th century. But it's really something within our own ranks that is this culture of the therapeutic, the psychoanalytic movement beginning with Freud.
Okay. So Freud is one of the modern thinkers who's commonly appealed to as influencing modern thought. In addition to Freud, there's Marx, there's Darwin. We have several other people who are thought to have affected the way we think about things, and Freud's certainly one of those. He shows up in The Brave New World in many places, along with Henry Ford, as really the chief influence, I think, behind The Brave New World, which, of course, was one of the 2 great prophecies of the 20th century, in addition to Orwell's 1984, contrasting visions of the future, contrasting dystopias. And of course, I think everyone would have to admit by now that Brave New World is the one that really ended up happening. Orwell's being the vision of that we are sort of enslaved by what we hate, and Huxley's vision, we're enslaved by what we love. And that's certainly what happened. We've just followed our desires, the freedom of following your desires, which is what the civilization, what the cultural authorities at that time wanted them to do, interestingly enough, which is sort of like where we are now. So we have Freud, and he mentions 2 other people in the 1987 preface to this book. He said there's 3 forces that break every rung of the old ladder of faith. I like that expression. Nietzsche's artist, who he says is faithful to his endless roles, and Weber's bureaucrat, the master organizer of our passionate indifference to our real needs. These sort of, I think he thinks, precede Freud, and then we get Freud. So what does Freud do that's maybe different from what Nietzsche does and different from what Weber's bureaucrat is wanting to do?
I think what Freud adds to the mix is this attitude of the therapeutic that is the central theme of the book, that people have these neuroses, these sicknesses of their soul, anxieties, fears, obsessions. And Freud noticed that as belief in God, belief in Christianity, belief in the old regime of restrictions and rules was fading, these neuroses were increasing. But rather than recommending, therefore, a return to those full constraints and re-up on your belief in God, what Freud teaches his patients is to accept, come to a place of acceptance that there is no God, that these religion, the old moral rules never had any legitimacy anyway, and therefore to integrate their neuroses and find some sort of way of living in the world without any kind of ultimate meaning. So it's not Nietzsche's triumphant revaluation of all values and the assertion of the Übermensch, and it's not the bureaucratic management of all of our conflicts through procedural means. It's this internal and highly individualistic, simple acceptance of a life that ultimately has no transcendent meaning.
Yes. So is this book primarily about culture, or is it about personality? How do those relate in here? Which one is primary for him, or is there one?
Well, I think part of the problem is that for nearly all of human history, culture has been primary, that we first have communities and individuals come to exist within those communities, and they shape their personality, they shape their whole way of life by being a member of these communities that aren't optional, can't be escaped. Your family, your country, your church, creed, dogma, these kinds of things. But that part of the inversion that has happened is that there is now this priority of the individual and the individual's personality, my preferences, my desire to integrate my own life and find meaning in my own life. And I might, in doing that, I might opt in to a religion. I might join some sort of cultural club. I might pursue the fine arts or self-identify as this or that. But all of those things are optional and something that the individual signs on to now. And that's why it is an anti-culture instead of a genuine culture.
Right. I remember some historian, I don't remember who it was now, who was talking about if you take a wheel with spokes on it going to a hub. I think he was talking about the history of Rome, and he said in Roman times everything was centripetal. It all went toward the center of something, and that center was the cultural center. Mm-hmm. It was Roman order, and so the idea to a Roman, the idea that you would want this centrifugal force, that it was outward on the spokes, that would be a good thing, would just be a completely alien thought to them.
Right.
You mentioned the inversion of priorities. One of the things he says in this book is that it's now really the self that we, he doesn't say worship, but privilege, we'll say. Mm-hmm. It's the self that is now privileged rather than the culture. And so is that the same sort of, when you talk about inversion of priorities, is that centrifugal force that is now privileged over the centripetal, the outward as opposed to the inward?
Right. Yes.
I mean, in a sense, it's a weird metaphor because maybe the question is, what is now the hub? Has the hub changed? You've taken,
Right. So I agree, but I think it needs to be a little bit more complex here because one of the things an insight I gained in reading Rieff is that the older model of culture really did have a kind of balance between that, what you're calling the centripetal and the centrifugal, what he calls control and release. So all cultures, he argues, have these two functions: to control our instincts. So rather than, when I get angry and I just lash out at people or say a mean thing or something like that, or if I have sexual impulse to just, go after anything, or if I have a instinct for self-aggrandizement or power over other people and I just go and do that. Well, one of the things and the primary function of culture for Rieff is to put restraint upon that and to prioritize something outside of myself. However, there's a wrinkle, because the second function of culture is also to prescribe particular modes of release and to specify the proper sphere in which we can satisfy our instincts, in which we can have a feast and eat, or within marriage, sexuality has a certain proper and legitimate domain. There's a proper place for righteous anger. Okay,
so there's prohibitions, but there is an organized system of allowing for deviations from those.
Right. Exactly, or what he calls a release of that kind of pressure that builds. If it was entirely just all control, we would go nuts.
He says on page 3, a reorganization of those dialectical expressions of yes and no, the interplay of which constitutes culture. Transforming motive into conduct is occurring throughout the West, particularly in the United States and England. It is to be expected that some instruments appropriate to our inherited organization of permissions and restraints upon action will not survive the tension of the fundamental reorganization. Is that what you're talking about,
right?
These permissions and restraints?
Right, exactly. And so I just want to add that nuance because I don't think it's quite right, or it would be too simplistic to think that the old way is just all constraint, and then now this new world that we find ourselves in is total release. So then how should we characterize the inversion? There's a nice quote that I like on page 19 that I think sets it up. He says, "Religious man was born to be saved. Psychological man is born to be pleased." And I think that captures it right there. What he calls therapies of commitment are the old way, that we heal the disorders of our soul by committing to a system of value, a system of restraint, of moral laws, of ideals, okay? And by committing these older systems, Christianity being the primary one, okay, is the promise is that we will be saved. Right, that there's some sort of salvation for our problems if we will go all in on the system of commitment. But now, what's the goal? Is it to be saved? Is it to commit to anything outside of ourselves? No. For psychological man, the goal is to be pleased and to feel good. And he discusses in many ways throughout the idea that it's not the good life, but simply living nicely.
Is Freud wanting to get rid of guilt? Is this a problem? Is this one of the problems he's trying to solve? What is?
I think so. Because I think for Freud, guilt as such is a neurosis.
Yeah.
And we need some kind of release from that. And that's part of the process of acceptance.
Yes. Yes. At the beginning of one of the chapters here, the beginning of the introduction, he has Yeats' poem, The Second Coming. What is the relevance of that poem to this book on page 1, which is talking about things falling apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The poem is about this decentering and how things sort of fly off from their orbit around some center that was there. Is that relevant to what he's talking about here?
I think you need to read the next 2 lines of the poem there, because I think it captures the sentiment perfectly. The best lack all conviction. So what's given way is that even the best spokesman for religion, for the old order of society, you'll notice when they speak, there's almost a tone of apology to their voice. And I think this is true. You can just turn on just about any Christian YouTube or any kind of Christian media, conservative media. You listen to just about any Republican politician on the TV, and they lack a conviction. They don't speak with the same kind of conviction. If you just go and you read a 16th century or a 17th century or a 5th century or a 8th century Christian author. So the best lack all conviction, while the worst men are full of passionate intensity. Okay, so all the energy is on the side of those who are tearing down, and they have this fervor for the culture of release, the anti-culture of release, for tearing down any constraints upon individual desire. That's where all the passion and the energy is, and that's why we get this sense that the center isn't holding anymore.
Yeah.
That everything's flying apart.
It's the people who are the most ignorant who are the loudest voices.
Exactly.
Yeah. Why can't we have the best that is full of passionate intensity?
Right.
We don't really have that anymore. We still need to talk more about what the book asserts, but we were talking a little bit several days ago about where Rieff exactly was on this. It's hard sometimes to pin him down on what he actually thinks. Sometimes he seems to be talking out of the role of Freud, maybe, or somebody who is very much in favor of getting rid of the old ladder of faith, and then yet he will implicitly critique what has actually happened.
Right.
And I wonder, what are your thoughts on where Rieff is on? Does Rieff think that it's a good thing that this sacred order is now really falling? Does he even believe that, in fact, it is? Because there is this difference between the perception of what is happening, which is in and of itself important, and whether the thing is happening. So a person could argue, well, Christianity is just as relevant in the philosophical sense as something that warrants rationally our belief. And yet, culturally, its power has diminished. Where is Rieff on there? What is Rieff saying? Is he saying it's just no longer rational to believe it, or is he just saying that the decline of faith has occurred in our culture? It's that people, whatever its reasonableness, uh, adherence to it has diminished. What is he? Where do you think he is on that?
Well, I think it's important to note that Rieff wasn't a Christian.
Sure.
But
it says, and he does use Christianity here, but he also seems to include in that all of the sort of traditional
many other
Western
aspects of
faiths,
Western
right?
culture,
The Judaism and so on.
Right. So I think it's important to note that he's not a faithful Christian who is raising this critique of modernity and saying, well, look, we need to just go back to the old faith. We were right all along. Okay, that would be something, sort of my own perspective, right? And I think it would be tempting for Christians to, in an all too easy way, co-opt Rieff to make that kind of argument. But I think that that's not getting him right, because I think he's sympathetic to Freud, Nietzsche, these other thinkers in the 19th century who saw that in order for the morality of Christianity and of European culture to really have teeth, for it to really actually do its job of restraining our behavior, it has to be not optional. It has to be something that the entire society is behind. Okay, it can't just be a fringe club that you join. And two, you have to really believe it. You have to, and not just notionally believe it, but in your bones, believe in God, believe in the revelation of Jesus Christ. And Rieff, I think, and I'm fairly sure, found those things not credible anymore. And so I think he sees what, from his own perspective, not mine, let's just be clear, Nietzsche and Freud are right to think that something has to give. There has to be something new, okay? But he does not like the solutions. And some of this becomes clearer if we go beyond this particular book. So Rieff dropped out of public life for 30 years after this book, but then posthumously had set up for publication a trilogy of analysis of modern life. And the first volume is My Life Among the Death Works, okay, in which he meditates upon all of these, what's happened to culture since the 60s when this was published. And there I think it becomes very clear that he is entirely antagonistic towards this anti-culture that has taken the place of the old faith. And Rieff thinks that we are inherently, as human beings, religious creatures, that we have to have some kind of religious faith. And so if the old religion has become incredible, then he thinks we need to find something else to take its place. And we have to be very cautious about that because many of the religions that human beings invent for themselves are deadly.
Right. Well, now you say that we have to believe it, but I mean, in fact, didn't modern culture, if we can include, a couple hundred years in under that label, there was an undermining of religious faith. Mm-hmm. The 19th century England, it started with the intelligentsia who abandoned a belief in traditional religion, but it's still held to by the lower classes. But then even that sort of goes away, and everybody is sort of kind of doesn't think it's true, but you sort of get this idea of it's the beautiful lie. Mm-hmm. And culture goes on under the same system of permissions and restraints for quite a while after that.
Right.
And it happens in England before it happens here. The same thing starts to happen here. G.K. Chesterton during the Edwardian era, beginning of the 20th century, where where England has really already kind of gone down the tubes in terms of religious faith. He says, America is a nation with the soul of a church. Well, that was true at that time, but now we see the outworking of secularism on every level of our own society. Does Rieff, Thomas Hardy wrote a poem called God's Funeral. Thomas Hardy, the great British novelist, also poet, and what the poem articulated was Hardy was not a believer, but he's describing this funeral of God and talking about the sadness that people had, even people who did not like the deceased, and it was portraying this idea that Hardy clearly had this sadness at the death of God, of the cultural death of God, the loss of faith, that it was a nice thing while we had it. It actually kind of worked. But now we've let that go. And now we're going to have to live with the consequences of the death of God. And what is that going to bring about? Does he address the question, what happens after this sort of Nietzschean idea of the cultural death of God, the loss of belief in culture? What replaces it? Does he address this at all?
Towards the very end, in the last chapter, he has some guesses about what he thinks is going to happen, and they're not good. So part of it is one guess that he has is that the religious leaders themselves just become psychoanalysts, basically, psychotherapists. And so all the priests and the pastors then come to redefine their role, not as preaching a community of commitment and strong moral dictates, but as self-help gurus, and to use modern or contemporary terminology.
And has that not happened in many cases?
And I think he nailed it. It's really striking to see that he wrote this in the 60s, and I think that's exactly what's happened. He also predicts almost exactly the culture war. This is on page 52, where he analyzes this waiting game, where he says we're in this limbo period in the culture, and how are we going to move forward? Well, you have a kind of stalemate between two groups of people, the people who want to see a greater release of moral constraint to open up more opportunity for their individual freedom. And then you see people who are worried and don't know how to live a life without moral constraint and rules and whatnot. And so they want to go back to the old ways and double down on old systems of constraint. And neither one of those has really the upper hand. So they're just sort of like sitting across the room from one another, eyeing each other, waiting for their opportunity to strike, and doing this arms race to try to get more and more cultural power. So these are the predictions that he has, but he's very thin on any actual prescriptions for what we need to do to move into some kind of solution to the problem that we find ourselves in.
The purpose of the Memoria College Master's Program in the Classics is to enable teachers, school administrators, and students to enter the great discussion, the conversation about truth, goodness, and beauty that's been going on in the Western world for over 2,000 years. We do this by reading the great books, talking about them, and writing about them. Our tutors help students to encounter the great classics of theology, philosophy, literature, ethics, political theory, law, and science. There's a lot you can do with great teachers and great books. But you can do even more when you also have great students, and we do.
And I have said this, and I've told my students that I've been teaching at undergraduate level for almost 20 years, and my Memoria College students are the best students I've ever taught. They're on fire for classical education, and they want to learn, and they're very smart, and the collaborative discussion was just out of this world, and I felt as if I was being taught as much as I was teaching.
Our liberal arts curriculum may strike many people as absolutely insane. These great books won't necessarily help you get a better job. So this might leave you wondering what the point of all this reading is. So what are the liberal arts for? Most fundamentally, they're for themselves. They're for your capacity to communicate effectively and clearly. They're for your decision making. They're for your character and your growth.
Let's face it, we only have so much time in our busy modern lives. We need to make sure we keep in mind Thomas Aquinas' great admonition. The slightest knowledge of the greatest things is greater than the greatest knowledge of the slightest things. In other words, we need to make our time count.
To learn to love language, to be steeped in history by sound reading and long conversation, to compose a sentence worthy of remembering, to do all this is to cast off, I think, the blinders of self, to leave Plato's cave, and to accustom our eyes to a light that blinds, but once our spiritual eyes adjust, can elevate and ennoble.
Memoria College. Great books, great teachers, great students. So in some sense, he is, as he states here, not. This is not him talking, he says this, mourners at the wake for Christian culture.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, don't you think he thinks it would be nice if we had something legitimate
Mm-hmm.
that could now order the modern personality, for one thing,
Mm-hmm.
and the modern culture in general. He does seem to want that, but he sort of asks that question, what now can tie us to the great chain of being? Because one of the problems here, when you get rid of religion, which serves many
Mm-hmm.
roles, but one is the way you interpret reality. It's also the things that gives meaning.
Right.
And there was a sort of a postulate in the old age of faith that there was a certain order to reality that we could count on. And we accommodated our personalities to that order. So now that that's gone, that meaning is gone.
Mm-hmm.
And that causes, and he seems to see this, it causes all kinds of problems.
Right.
How you can't really go on
Right.
without any kind of meaning. And so he seems to say that what Freud does is he tries to replace it with this analytic
Mm-hmm.
process, so that, and this always, I always wondered, why do so many people go to counselors and psychologists? And I never understood that. I was not a tortured soul, I guess, so I didn't have, but I realized at one point that this was now their religion. And not that everybody who goes to a counselor, I'm just saying that for some of these people, their psychologist, their therapist was their pastor. Now, their pastor wasn't their therapist, but the therapist was their pastor. That there was something going on there, and it was the result of having to find something else by which you could order yourself. Is that a reasonable thing?
Right. I mean, he describes here the replacement of the old community of commitment
Mm-hmm.
with the community of two. I thought
Mm-hmm.
that's a apt phrase. The community of two, of the therapist and the patient.
Mm-hmm.
And that all the old authorities are replaced by the authority of the therapist. And I think that this is strikingly a problem for all of us. Even anyone who's listening who hears this and says, "Well, that's not me. I have meaning in my life because I'm a committed Christian and I thoroughly believe it, and I still believe in God." I think it's still a problem for all of us, because even the people who are most thoroughly convinced of the truth of their faith and most involved, they go to church multiple times a week, they do all the Christian things, it's still a group that they have chosen, they've opted into in society. And most of the time they go to work and most of their coworkers do not agree with them. They go to the grocery store and nearly everybody in the grocery store does not agree with them. And so psychologically that has an impact. So even if you think that whatever it is that you're committed to is true, there's this background optionality to it, because you know that at any moment you could stop going to church and there would be no social repercussions. Well, there might be local with your immediate group of friends, but our society would support you as a whole. And you could get along just fine. Your finances would be fine. And so that even in the floating in the background, we have this question that you just raised of ultimate meaning. Because it seems that in all human cultures to the present point, that meaning was given as a default, that people lived within a certain worldview. They didn't choose a worldview. They lived within that worldview, and it was given to them, right? And it wasn't this optional thing that they chose as a lifestyle preference choice, you know? And so it really is a crisis for all of us.
Well, we seem to require something through which we can find meaning in our world, and that we can find our place in that system of meaning. We all inherently have that. And, I remember several years ago now, you had all of these young Western men who were joining ISIS. And you wonder, well, why was that? Well, because there was the system being propounded by this group that gave a person meaning. It was evil, but it was a way
with conviction.
Yeah, there was a cause. Yeah. There was a war to fight. This is the good aspect of wars, is they give everybody in the country who's doing it meaning, and everyone's on the same page. And it's a given. Go back to your point. So now we don't have that anymore, and it seems like that falls apart. So we get the 60s and the 70s. I always say the 70s is when the 60s really happened. That's when there was the rebellion among one sector in society, and then it just started creeping into everything else, media and the popular culture. Then we had to. What did we have to do in the wake of the loss of this belief in this sacred order, this given that we all operated under? We had to form movements to advocate our belief in the older sacred order. So now what we have in our society, we're starting. There's some cohesion there. There's some community in which you can reconnect yourself to that system of meaning. It's in these movements now,
right?
But it's not pervasive across the whole culture. It's no longer a given. It's a group of people. It's a community that I have to elect to join in some way. Am I interpreting this correctly?
Yes, and I think many people now have pointed out that many of our political ideologies today have many features in common with religion. They make strong moral claims, much more than political movements of the past. You have strong guilt associated, demands for total commitment to the ideology, and shame if you're not totally committed to the ideology. even emotional release. You watch videos from some of these various political rallies, and they feel like charismatic worship services.
Right. Doesn't religion abhor a vacuum?
That's exactly right. And this is part of Rieff's point, is that there really is no way out for us as human beings, because psychologically we are necessarily religious. Philosophically, maybe you could be an atheist, okay? But psychologically, it's impossible,
right?
Because we have to find meaning somewhere, and we have to worship something. And the great danger, of course, is that virtually everything there is to worship, this is David Foster Wallace's point in his famous commencement address, is that virtually everything there is out there to worship will eat you alive if you aren't careful.
Yeah. And so, I mean, he's writing here in the 60s. And I think that the therapeutic mindset was perhaps stronger then, because I wonder if something else has happened since then. Because he says in the book that our cultural revolution is directed at all the institutions of compulsion. Religion being the chief, because it's operating in the realm of morality, which is the most fundamental thing. So we're rebelling against rules and against order, but we can't be entirely, as I said, religion abhors a vacuum. So we've got to replace it with something. And so I'm wondering if all the woke stuff that's going on right now, I mean, it does seem as if there is a new secular religion, which is a contradiction in terms, Freud uses the term anti-culture. I guess you could call that an anti-religion, but it's posing as a religion. It is providing people with a system of meaning in some way, but that system of meaning is against all restraint, and yet it does seem to display this yearning for something.
But I think a striking thing is that we are seeing a return of certain kinds of restraint. There's heavy restraint on certain things that you can say and not say, very particular words. A lot of this whole cultural revolution started, and much of this book, the subtext, is it's really all about sex, right? And when we're talking about restraint, we're primarily talking about restraint on sexual morality. There's other forms, of course, but that's the real thing that throughout the 20th century has been animating a lot of these movements. But now, we see a reassertion of whole codes of sexual behavior around consent and what's acceptable in the workplace and what you can say to somebody and what you cannot say to somebody. And again, I think this is because as human beings, we simply have to have some kinds of codes of behavior,
some system of restraint,
because if people just do whatever they want, then you have chaos and you can't actually have a livable society. Now, what I think is interesting here is that the old systems of constraint were predicated upon belief in some kind of higher ideal, some kind of philosophy, some kind of transcendence. Whereas what he mentions is that we're in this very strange, and in the whole history of human beings, a novel situation where the constraints are being enforced legally, procedurally, economically. And so you get a system of restrained behavior without anybody having to actually buy into any particular philosophy, religion, claims to truth. It's just simply, well, if you do this, we will sue you. Or if you do this, you will be deplatformed. Or if you do this, there will be economic consequences. End of story. Believe whatever you want privately, right? And I don't know yet. I don't think anybody knows yet how that will turn out, because, as I mentioned, it's a novel thing. We can't. No society has tried to restrain in that way before.
Mm-hmm. Now he says on page 4, the question, because I guess what you wonder in reading Rieff is, can we still have a civilization without that sacred order behind it? And he says on page 4, the question is no longer, as Dostoevsky put it, can civilized men believe? Rather, can unbelieving men be civilized? And I guess this is the project they're trying to attempt,
right,
is to civilize unbelieving people. And is that really possible? And will the anti-religions and the anti-culture that he talks about in there, and he clearly seems to doubt that this can work, right? What's going to replace this? Do we see yet what that's going to look like? Is that going to satisfy everybody? And what seems to have happened is that we are now warring with one another. Because in several times in here, he talks about this idea of ends and means, that we've always had differences on the means towards certain ends, but we've always agreed on the ends. And it seems to me like this is the really worrisome turn in our own culture, which I think has really come to the fore in the last 2 or 3 decades, where we're no longer debating amongst each other about how to accomplish shared goals. Now we differ on what the actual goals are. We are now questioning very fundamental human things, gender being one of them. And we're hearing people propagate views that would have been thought just purely absurd just 20 years ago. Is there I guess what Rieff would say would be, how does a culture operate in the absence of shared ends? We can debate the means all we want. We've always done that. But can we have a civilization without shared ends?
Right. This is one of the another striking insight from this book, that until I had read this book, I hadn't quite thought of it in exactly these terms, but that he points out all civilizations prior to us have required shared ends in order to survive. You have to identify some kind of commonality to organize a community around. I just taught Aristotle's Politics last night to our Memoria College students. Mm-hmm. And the famous first sentence of the Politics, right, is that every community is formed with a view to some good. Mm-hmm. Period. End of story. All right. But now we have procedural, I don't even want to call them communities, aggregates, masses of people that live in these gargantuan juggernaut cities, and they don't need to believe the same thing. They don't need to be pursuing the same thing. They don't need to even know each other. They don't need to have any kind of common culture, common language, anything, because we have these impersonal procedural mechanisms, laws, market mechanisms, technological mechanisms, social media, transactions over the internet, that more or less guarantee peaceful coexistence, okay, with ruptures to that here and there. But for the most part, I can go and I can transact business with a total stranger over the internet. I can, walk down the street and do whatever I want in New York City, and I don't need to know any of those people or believe any of the same things. And we have kind of this machine that makes that all function more or less acceptably, more or less comfortably. And the very strange and kind of frightening thing about this machine is that it appears to have taken on a life of its own without any soul. The machine just keeps on churning without having any philosophy necessarily behind it. If I asked you, what is the philosophy of the United States government, the DEA, or the bureaucracy, what is the philosophy of the FBI? What is the philosophy of Congress? Those would seem to most of us absurd questions because they don't need any kind of shared commitment. They just work. They just keep on or fail to work half the time. And so the question is, can you have a civilization in the absence of a shared commitment to some kind of good? Well, Aristotle would say, no, by definition, that's not going to be a community, a koinonia. It's not a civilization, but it's something.
Well, on page 33, he says, psychological man may be going nowhere, but he aims to achieve a certain speed and certainty in the going.
Uh-huh.
We are sort of given these procedural opiates, I guess. They're at least something we can count on, right? That flights are going to get out on time, which even that's a problem now. but that there are, we have all of the results of a great civilization at our disposal in many ways. Technology being one of them. Technology, I think, being maybe today the greatest opiate of the masses. And so we have all these ways to...
Physical safety, air conditioning.
Right, yeah. And so we have all these ways to, be comfortable, is what you're talking about there, and to amuse ourselves so that we don't have to think about the deeper problems of our existence or the meaning or meaninglessness of our own lives. I mean, that's what Huxley is talking about. People are basically given everything they desire, everything, and yet they don't have the one thing, which is a meaningful life. And this is what John the Savage, a character in that book, wants to assert, is that this is an important thing. And the only reason he's able to know that and articulate it to himself is because he's grown up outside that system. And it almost, in order to even see this problem, it does almost require you to kind of step back from it and not become too involved in it to see the problems, because the people who are in it, most people, I would say, don't see it. Now, they may be anxious, they may be fundamentally unhappy, but they try to cover up that unhappiness by all of these things that this great civilization that we built on this sacred order has given us. So he asked the question, what institutions are going to replace, because it's these institutions of restraint that that people after the sacred order has been abandoned, they don't want that anymore. So they're going to seek some other kind of, and one of the questions he asks is, what are the institutions that are going to replace the older ones? And I think here he's saying one of this is the therapeutic institutions of our society. I think it's interesting that every time, for example, there's a school shooting, what do? They bus in counselors to deal with and I always wonder, does that ever really help? We feel like we have to do that, and we feel like we have to say that we're doing that. We're going to bus in the therapists. But is that going to really every time I see that, I think is that really going to solve anybody's problem? Because most of those people, it was the shootings in Newtown, Connecticut, I think, those people, I noticed they, for some reason there, didn't do that. They all went to church. And there was a church service on CNN of all places where these people had gone because they were finding something there that you've got to know that the therapists they bus in really don't have to offer, which I think is really just reconnecting people with the older sacred order by retelling the narrative of that older religious belief and singing songs about it and doing all those things that we do in the old order to deal with grief and tragedy. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the things in here, I'm thinking of like these school shootings that we've been having, and we're going to deal with these through therapy. One of the things he talks about, one of the ways we try to solve this problem is through science. He mentions that in one place. Can science solve this problem for us? Is this a new? I think he sort of views it as sort of another way of organizing our beliefs. Science,
Right?
Is that going to solve the meaning problem?
Well, I think this solves one kind of psychological problem, this need for some kind of stable bedrock of truth, that people have at least the perception that, okay, there is this body of facts that gives us these scientific deliverances of this is the way the world really is. And that deals with a certain kind of discomfort. And, when I teach freshman students at, big state schools like Kentucky, the students often speak of science with this kind of capital S intonation, that science is this quasi-divine eternal reality that just makes pronouncements of what is true with a capital T. Going back in the conversation, you had asked or had mentioned that there seems to have been some kind of shift since the 1960s in the way that people think about therapy, psychoanalysis. Freudianism is out. Nobody's really doing the kind of therapy that he's talking about in this book anymore, or at least very few people are. It's not as popular. And I think part of the reason why it has shifted is that therapy itself has gotten much more scientific in its language, in its tenor, in its approach. People want evidence-based treatments, right? They want medications for things that are wrong with their brains, and it's molecular and it's chemical. And there's much less in the vein of Freud and Jung, which were scientific in one kind of sense, but they were interested in finding what are the ultimate meanings of things and why people are doing what they're doing.
Couldn't you say it was a more philosophical psychology,
right?
In a way, I mean, Freud is reasoning to he's not. I mean, he's doing clinical practice, and he's trying his ideas, but his ideas are coming from this philosophical assessment of where we are as a culture, where we are as individuals in this.
And as Rieff explains, Freud actively resisted psychological treatment or explanations that relied on materialistic reduction to just chemicals in the brain and whatnot.
Well, right, which is an important issue because Rieff does mention here that sort of the medicalization of psychology, and so have drugs taken the place of the therapist now in many cases.
Well, that's exactly what happens in Brave New World.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
They have this drug, Soma, that makes people feel fine, like there's no problems at all.
Well, and if Freud is right, as he's described by Rieff, that what has happened is that we have lost this integrating order of meaning. And so we have this anxiety here that has to be dealt with. And he's going to deal with it by, it seems, thinking about it more in a way. And that now sort of focusing on the self and becoming a part of your own treatment. Because I guess that at least gives you something to do and to think about other than, the loss of an order of meaning. But Freud, he wants us to accept the demise of the old order and then just deal with it. And we'll go on. I want to ask just a couple questions about Jung and Rieff, who he also talks about in here. But that he's trying to treat this feeling, I guess you would say, and trying to deal with that feeling. And if dealing with these feelings of meaninglessness and of self-identity and all the things that happen when you lose your religion, if that is the problem, then it seems to me that drugs that change that feeling are a perfect solution, if that's the way you think. Right? So then you just, you take Prozac or you take whatever you're going to take to deal with those feelings. And I would think that they probably work a whole lot better than therapy.
Right. If that's the
problem.
If the problem is a bad feeling, then get rid of the bad feeling and no more problem.
Right. So that's an interesting thought. That and he doesn't really talk about drugs at all in here. And of course, now all kinds of books have come out on drugs that we're giving to children in schools. I just heard a statistic yesterday: 1/4, I think it's of boys at a certain age in school are being given drugs to deal with lack of attention deficit disorder and all these sorts of things. And again, if that's the problem, then drugs certainly can be. So why aren't we just satisfied with that? Haven't we found the solution?
Well, I think we instinctively know that there is a deeper problem about our place in the world beyond just how we feel about our place in the world. And we need to actually have some kind of knowledge about it.
Yeah. So later on in the book, he talks about some of Freud's adherents, followers, who went off in a little bit of a different direction, right? And he talks about Carl Jung, and he talks about William Reich and D.H. Lawrence. He mentions Alfred Adler in here as well, who went a different direction. What did they do that was going beyond or in contradiction to Freud?
I think Rieff's argument is that Freud, and Rieff, I think, thinks that this is right? That this is the right response given the situation that Freud finds himself in. Freud counseled his patients not to try to find meaning in life, but to accept the meaninglessness of life in the absence of the old order, God, religion, morality. Okay, to move forward and find a acceptable way of living in the absence of any ultimate belief. Whereas all of these adherents, and this is where Rieff thinks that they go off the rails, they try to invent some new kind of ultimate meaning. And so Jung does this in a quasi-religious way, trying to find a religious symbolic that's behind all the world's mythic archetypes and symbols. Reich tries to do this politically with political action, socialism. D.H. Lawrence tries to do it with the ultimacy of pleasure and immediacy of pleasurable experience. But none of them could see what Freud saw, which is that in the absence of God, none of these things actually provide any ultimate meaning. And they're not sustainable because an individual might be able to kind of psych themselves out, so to speak, and get themselves to believe, yes, okay, this is really ultimately meaningful. But over time and in aggregate, people will realize that these are mere inventions and coping mechanisms to give their lives meaning in the absence of meaning.
Yeah. He says on page 35, it's not the repressions that trouble us now, but the permissions. It is the meaninglessness of life that causes the disturbance of the unconscious. And he says, for Jung's patients past the age of 35, as for mature civilization in general, the problem in the last resort consists in finding a religious outlook of life. which Freud didn't want to do because he wanted you to accept the meaninglessness. So Jung and Reich and Lawrence seem to be wanting to replace traditional religion with something like it, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, particularly Jung. I think Jung's a fascinating thinker. He talks about these archetypes that you see throughout the history of civilization. And he seems to be wanting to replace any specific religion with some sort of generic religion of archetypes that will address the meaning problem, not in the way that Freud wants to do it, which is just the acceptance of it and then deal with it, but with a system of meaning and saying that there is meaning in the world. And these are ways you can think about the world that will help you to see the meaning of things. And he doesn't go into it too much, but is that something that can work? Can this Jungian idea of providing these archetypes, these generic templates that other religions can really fill in and are specific about, can you do it through that? Can you?
I don't necessarily want to get too far into Jung because it gets complicated. Right.
And he's really hard to understand even.
Yes, but no, I mean, as I just alluded, I think that ultimately we have this sense that that attempt to reconstruct a private religion from one's own experience of the collective unconscious it doesn't have the fixity that's necessary and that an actual religion has. It doesn't have the specificity. And so the problem here throughout the whole book, and the thing that all these systems are meant to address, is what happens when you're tempted. Right? What happens when you have a desire? And any kind of system of control, morality, religion, belief, politics, whatever, tells you not to do something. The issue is that if there is a lingering optionality or fuzziness to the control system, it's very, very easy to just give in to the temptation. I mean, even thoroughly convinced Christians give in to temptations all the time. Okay. But if it's got that fuzziness, and if I can just kind of make the rules shift a little bit, change them, kind of reinterpret them a little bit to suit me, then it's not going to do the job that it's being called in to do. It's not going to actually control my behavior and help me resist temptation.
And it occurs to me that some of our listeners may not understand the system of controls and permissions and restraints. So you have these rules, the restraints, and then you have these permissions, and that's probably not the best word for that. But I mean, how does that actually happen in the traditional system? And it just occurred to me that we might want to give an example of that. And I think probably one example would be, and I'm going to use Catholicism simply because it's the most structured form of this, right? So where you have, it's done differently in Protestantism, but you have a system of rules. There are things that you are to do and things that you are not to do. And that if you fail in that in any way, there is in Catholicism, there's a specific procedure for this. It's the permissions part of it. There's the restraints. Then you have these permissions, which is you go to the priest, you confess your sin, you're given some form of penance to perform, and then you go on again.
But the key is it only works if you buy into it.
Yes, correct.
Completely.
Right.
It doesn't work if you're like, well, that's a nice, helpful system, but I don't know, over here, as soon as it starts to be a little inconvenient or something like that.
Sure. Yeah, right. Also, he talks about positive communities and negative communities. What does he mean by positive communities, which he associates with the older system, and negative communities, which he associates with this Therapeutic.
So a positive community he defines as one that promises salvation so long as you buy into it completely. It promises you some kind of
if you do this, then this.
Yes, if you join, if you play by the rules, if you do what we tell you to do, then there's some kind of salvation promised involved in that. Whereas a negative community promises a release from the positive communities. Mm-hmm. That if you take this counseling and take this advice, then we will release you from all the guilt trip that you have from growing up in Catholic school or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what we're left with, and we've replaced the dialectic of perfection based, he says, on the deprivational mode, the restraints. And it is being succeeded by a dialectic of fulfillment based on the appetitive mode. Is that ever going to work?
Well, you might feel pretty good for a little while.
Yeah.
Right. So it works in the sense that he talks about the goal becoming a subjective sense of well-being. Mm-hmm. And I do get the impression that just kind of looking around, there are an awful lot of people who, at least for pretty good stretches of time, it works. They feel pretty good. They, have a good time. They deal with their anxiety. They deal with their neuroses. They, are able to regulate their outbursts and whatnot. But will it work ultimately? I think that's the real question.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking of Oscar Wilde's remark. You have a little volume of Oscar Wilde in your hand there, I notice. It was an Oscar Wilde who said the best way to deal with temptation is to give in to it.
Right.
And yet he doesn't seem to do that in one of his great books.
Well, I have this quote from Picture of Dorian Gray, where Lord Henry, who is this character who is ironic throughout the whole book. He says these horribly wicked things, but everybody around him says, "Oh, you don't really believe that. You don't really mean it." And he's saying things just to be provocative that are of the spirit of the age, this kind of rising philosophy. The trouble is that Dorian Gray does listen to him and does take many of these things that he says quite seriously. And towards the very beginning of the book, I think this single sentence captures the spirit of the Therapeutic quite well. Lord Henry says, "The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. Resist it, and your soul grows sick with longing for the things it has forbidden to itself, with desire for what its monstrous laws have made monstrous and unlawful."
And that's the view we associate with Oscar Wilde himself. And yet it's negatively portrayed in this book. And I wonder...
So clearly disastrous, in fact, to follow that philosophy.
Effect. Yes. And so we've already talked, we talked a little earlier before the show about maybe doing this book as a follow-on, but the Picture of Dorian Gray. I think we'll do that next time.
Next episode.
Yes, I think it would be a great episode because it really sort of destroys all your preconceptions about Oscar Wilde. And there's a whole story of his life, which has a good ending, as I understand it. But that's when you mentioned that book before we went on the show, I thought that is a perfect book to follow from this book, because what's happened in Dorian Gray's life is what these people are really recommending. And you see how utterly devastating
the consequences,
that actually is. All right. Well, anything more you have on your mind about this particular book before we...
Well, I'm so rattled by our conversation that I'm going to have to do therapy.
Are you? Okay. Well, I hope to do that. Yes. Well, I mean, this is a really wonderful book. Like I said, I think it's one of the great intellectual books, and it just takes just one of these issues that we have in mind and really has some very interesting things to say about it. And he's a very quotable writer. He's got all sorts of ways to say things that your normal scientific person, which I will just, if I can use that label to include psychologists, aren't usually very good at doing. But he does it extremely well. He does, we haven't talked about this much, but he does, again, talk about Jung and William Reich and D.H. Lawrence and these people who also were very influential on modern society. And so it's very, very well worth reading. I noticed you mentioned his other 3 books that he did. They're not in print, I don't think, anymore, or they're just very expensive. I noticed, and you read this book and you think, my gosh, I want to know what else this guy has to say, because it's so utterly insightful about why things are the way they are. So thank you. And we'll discuss Dorian Gray next time.
Dorian Gray next time.
Thank you for joining us at Dust Jacket. This is the podcast for Memoria College. You can find out more about Memoria College's Master of Arts program and the great books and our seminar courses at memoriacollege.org. If you like today's program, please like it online and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'll see you next time on Dust Jacket.